weather today. It's also great to see that not too many people braved the weather today. We hope that you are at home today and that you are feeling nice and warm and toasty and safe within your house. We had reports of some potentially treacherous conditions by people who did make it in this morning. Even out here on the road in front of church, there were some icy patches. So if you did join us this morning in person, thank you for being here, but please be very, very careful on your way home. Remember, it could take you an extra half hour to get home, and that is terrific because it's better than an extra 3 or 4 days in a hospital or having to buy a new car. So please take your time. Go home slowly and be safe today. And if you're here this morning with us, and if you're online, reach out to us if you have questions about what you hear. If you're online and listening, reach out to us in the comment section and ask us questions. We'll do our best to reply to those. We feel it's very important for you to understand what it is that we're bringing to you in our messages and our lessons, and we want you to be blessed through the experience of our teaching and preaching. So this morning we're going to be in the Gospel of John, and we're going to be working our way through parts of the Gospel of John. Last week's message generated some interesting conversation, especially when I said the whole big point of the miracle that happened at the wedding feast in Cana of the turning of water into wine is often missed by people who read the story. In that they tend to look at all of the incidentals and miss the big lesson. The big lesson of that story was actually the contrast of Moses and Jesus, of the law, the old covenant, the new covenant. And so what I want to do today is I want to show you this concept of contrast in the Gospel of John. Now let me read you a couple of interesting definitions. The Oxford English Dictionary describes contrast this way: the state of being strikingly different from something else in juxtaposition or close association. Wikipedia defines contrast this way. It says, contrast is the difference in luminance or color that makes an object distinguishable. And those who are into web design define contrast like this. They say contrast is the ability to distinguish one object from another when seeing them in close proximity to each other. The ability to distinguish one object from another. Now, when we look at Scripture, there are different ways, and in fact, take it out of Scripture for just a minute and think of it in the idea of teaching. There are different ways for us to make something plain to someone's understanding. One of those ways is by comparing similarities. So we might say this automobile is kind of similar to this horse-drawn cart in that they both have an engine that's rated in somehow horsepower and wheels that turn, and they have a way to steer them. And if somebody understood one of those but not the other, by comparing the similarities among them, you would be able to relate it to what they already knew and show them how one is sort of a form of the other, right? So this is a good way to do it, by similarity. Another way to teach it is through some sort of foundationalism, to say this was the beginning, and then added onto it was this, and added onto it was that. Another way is to break it down by components and say everything of this type. For instance, let's stick with cars for a minute, because that's one that everybody seems to be able, and most of our audience would seem to be able to identify with. We would say that all cars have an engine, some power plant that drives the wheels so that the wheels turn, and they have a mechanism for steering. And they have, now, and by the way, this is going to be true whether it's an intelligent car that doesn't need a human driver or whether it's an old-fashioned Model T that's going to have an engine, some way to transmit that power to the wheels. It's going to have drive wheels and steerage wheels. Right? So by breaking it down by component, that's another way to teach people. But there is a third way that I think works extremely effectively, and that is by showing contrast. That is by showing dissimilarity between things. And John chooses in his gospel to use the method of contrast to show you Jesus Christ as juxtaposed against other things in order to reach his stated objective. And his stated objective is given to us in chapter 20, and that is that he wrote all of these things that we might believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and believing we would have life through his name. Right? So he's writing all this with the purpose of inspiring this faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, not as a prophet, not as a teacher, not as a moral person, but as the Son of God, to inspire faith in him so that people would be saved. That's why he wrote it. And I think it might bear some observation before we dig into the details to say, if you were to look up the gospel, do some research on the Gospel of John on your own, and I highly recommend that you do so. Most commentators and teachers of the Bible would say John was writing to Jews. I don't agree with that view personally. And the reason that I don't agree with that view is because of some of the phrases John writes. For instance, in the story of the wedding feast at Cana, John writes this. He said, in that place, there were 6 water pots, after the manner of purification of the Jews. In another place, he says, that time was about Passover, which is one of the Jewish feasts, right? So he's writing in a way to establish a context for people who are unfamiliar with that context. So I don't think he's writing to the Jews. I think he's writing it to a very broad audience and including terminology so you can understand some of the peculiarities of Judaism that are going to be important to understanding the story, right? So I think he's writing probably more to a general audience than to a Jewish audience. Okay. But I want to give you some of the contrast now that we're going to find in the Gospel of John. And what I want to see is that I hope to establish in your mind today that John's writing his gospel for a single targeted purpose, and that single targeted purpose is to show Jesus Christ clearly as the Son of God, and the tool, the device he's going to use to do that is contrast. So he's going to be constantly contrasting things. And you're going to see that he actually selects a different set of incidents from the life of Jesus Christ than most of the other gospel authors did. And he's going to, when he does select the same incident that some of the other gospel writers selected, he will select a different set of facts or occurrences or phrases out of that same incident, because he's not trying to record for you some of the things that people have already given. He's trying to show you this contrast of Jesus and everything else. Which means, if I'm right, that we're going to constantly be seeing phrases of comparison in the Gospel of John. And this is what gives it away that he's doing this contrast. And today I want us to come to that same brilliant understanding that John targets, which is that Jesus Christ is different from everybody else. He is the Son of God, and that we might have faith in his name. Okay, so here it is. Beginning in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Now I want you to notice the comparisons that he has already laid out. He's laid out the first initial comparison. So John goes all the way back to prehistory, right? Before recorded history that we find in Genesis 1:1. He actually goes back before that to establish this context for us and begin to establish the comparisons that he's going to use moving forward, right? So this is he's like way back. And by the way, I think it might be interesting to point out a couple of observations along the way about the time in the Gospel of John, and we're going to see it unfold, and we're going to see that John plays kind of fast and loose with time for a reason, because he's not as concerned with the sequence of events for the most part as he is the one in the events. Okay, so he says, light, dark. Here's the first comparison for you. He says, this one who came, this one who was from the beginning. So if you looked at all the comparisons we have so far, we have some who aren't from the beginning, they're created later. This one was from before the beginning, before creation. This one was the original motivator of all creation, the original creator, ancient of days before anyone else, maker of all things, without whom nothing was made that was made. And this one is light. Everything else is darkness. Right? So these are the comparisons. He's already starting out saying, this is light, not darkness. And he's giving you the setup, right? So now go down to verse 6. There was a man sent from God. Now look how the period of time he skips. He starts at prehistory, skips everything in the old covenant, and lands on John. Right? No Moses, no law, no flood, no Adam. Doesn't think those things are important for you to understand. And in fact, they aren't. When we go out and preach the gospel, we have no need to preach Adam. We have no need to preach Moses. We have no need to preach the law. None of that mattered. Tell you what matters. What mattered was Jesus was the creator of all things, was light and not darkness. And God sent someone to testify about it. That's what John starts out with, okay? So there was a man sent out from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light. Oh, okay, here's another comparison for you. John was not the light, but he was sent to bear witness of the light. It's almost as if he had an idea that Islam might be coming. And that he needed to make this really clear statement that said, you know what John was? John was not the one prophet of Jesus. No. Paul was not the one prophet of Jesus. No, there was no one prophet of Jesus. I'll tell you what there was. There was somebody who was sent to say, the light is coming. Dawn is on its way. Here comes the light. Are you the light? No, I am not the light. But there is a light coming, and it's Jesus, right? So that's what he sets out for John. So he says, first of all, there is light and there is dark. Jesus is the light. Then there was John, and John was not the light. Okay? So now going down to verse 17 in chapter 1. Jesus is better than Moses. Now, almost everybody would say, yeah, that's probably true. But notice what John says about it. The comparison he makes isn't just Jesus was better than Moses, but look at how he says this. This is the outline of the Son. You begin to see from the shadows of history, you begin to see a character emerge now. John was sent to bear witness. This character is light. You're going to see light against a very dark wall. And you're going to begin to see the outline of that character. And so here's the outline of that character. Well, give us an outline, John. Tell us, when we're scanning across all history, how is it we can pick out this one who you say was actually with God and was God in the beginning and was the creator of all things? Tell us how we see him, John. Okay, so here it is, okay? John bare witness of him and cried, saying, This is he of whom I spake. He that cometh after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness have we all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. Here's the comparison. Notice how different this is than any of the other three Gospels. Notice how the other Gospels begin with this story of how Jesus got here, either genealogically or the story of the early birth, the life of Jesus Christ, and they begin to tell you the story about Jesus without setting him in a context to clearly point out the difference. And here it is. So John is like, there's a gap in people's understanding. I'm going to fill it. Here it is. The law came by Moses. Now, there are those who will tell you you can find grace in the law. And in fact, there is some grace in the law. And when we think the law came by Moses, that should not be a discouraging or dark thing for us. The truth is, the world was in a deep darkness, and then God sent a message to Moses, gave him the 10 Commandments, and they shone like a bright light in a dark place. The commandments were not darkness. In fact, the commandments were ordained to life. What Moses got on the mountain was not something that plunged us into dark servitude. It was meant to give us brilliance that we could see by, to give us understanding about God, to tell us about ourselves. It was a marvelous revelation. It was a very bright revelation. But it wasn't the final one. And it wasn't the greatest one. It was the law. And the law was good. Paul tells us that in Romans. The law was just and good. It was ordained to life. I found it to be to death, but it was ordained to life. It changed history. It was beautiful. It just wasn't light enough. We needed a brighter light than the law. And that brighter light was Jesus, because although there was grace in the law, although there was truth in the law, the grace that we found in the law was very limited grace. And the truth that we found in the law was very limited truth. And I know some people who would find that very hard to say. But the fact that John writes it this way tells you that. The law came by Moses, and it was true. It just wasn't enough of the truth. We needed more. Grace was in the law, but it just wasn't enough grace. We needed something better. We needed the source of grace, and that was Jesus Christ. So when Jesus comes on the scene, grace and truth come by Jesus Christ. The law came by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. There's the comparison. If you wanted to see it, you would say, okay, here's the way I need to identify Jesus. I need to first see that there was a law of Moses, and standing against that law of Moses, in juxtaposition to the law of Moses, there is a greater grace. There is a greater truth than the law of Moses. Now, Paul tells us that over in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and he tells you that light that shone, as bright as it was in the law, wasn't sufficient. We needed a better light than that. And it came in Jesus Christ. And that's what John was saying. Where do you think Paul got it from? Paul didn't make that thing up out of nowhere. He got it. John actually wrote it down for him and said, this is the way it worked. Okay, go down to verse 19 of chapter 1. And you'll notice John's testimony. And notice the Pharisees, because you need to sort of see where he's setting up this juxtaposition. And this is the record of John, that the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who art thou?" And he confessed, and denied not, but confessed, "I am not the Christ." And they asked him, "What then? Art thou Elias?" He said, I am not. Art thou that prophet? What prophet are they talking about? Well, you see, in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses stands before the Jewish people and says, there's going to be another prophet that will arise, like me, only different. And you're going to listen to him. And they want to know, are you that one? Are you that one that Moses foretold us would come, that would be like Moses? And John says, no, not me, guys. You got the wrong guy. Not me, fellas. So the next thing we look at is we look at John himself and say, okay, so here's John, this great witness that was sent before the light, and we say, if we're going to find this one who's the Son of God, if we're going to find this one who's the one expected to come, that we're supposed to believe in, where we're supposed to get life in his name, how do we find him? Well, we look at the law of Moses and say, well, it's not that, but it's kind of like that, but not, we need more. Then we look at John and we say, okay, but it isn't John for sure. John says it isn't. But whatever it is, whoever this one is, he's going to be kind of like Elias, like Elijah, and kind of like that prophet that Moses said was going to come. Although we don't necessarily know what it is, but that's what it's going to be like. Because the Pharisees were looking for it. Verse 29 of John chapter 1. And this is, by the way, the beginning of a little sequence. So I'll show you this little sequence. The next day. In fact, in chapter 29, it says the next day. In verse 35, it says the next day again, which isn't meaning another next day. It means again on that same next day. Then chapter 1, verse 43 says, the following day, and then chapter 2, verse 1 says, the third day. So if we're thinking of it in the way they would have counted, which would have been the first day on which the Pharisees came to John is day 0. Then you would have the next day, that would be day 1, which you're going to find referenced in verses 29 and 35. Then you'd have day 2, the following day, which happens in John chapter 1, verse 43, and then you'd have the day after day 2, which would be day 3, the third day, which is the way he starts out, the phrase he starts out chapter 2 and verse 1 with, the third day. Now, I find this very interesting, and I'm not going to ask this, I'm just going to tell you this, because it's an odd thought, and I suspect none of us have ever thought about it before, very few of us ever have. But if you were living under the law, on what days of the week could you get married? And the answer is Tuesday or Wednesday. And here's the reason for that. Because the bridegroom, by their tradition, was in a 3-day feast leading up to the day of the wedding. And you wouldn't want to get married on a Thursday because the next day is Sabbath and you wouldn't have time to do any legal action. And if you got married and found out she wasn't a virgin, then you needed to present it the day after your wedding night in order for the wedding to be declared null because she was not a virgin when you married her and you thought she was. So you had to get married on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. Now, counting backward from there through the passage, and I'm not trying to throw a bunch of math at you this morning, although we're only counting to 3 here, so it's not quite so hard, right? Counting backward from there, that means that as soon as the Sabbath ended, the Pharisees were pretty excited about this thing with John, maybe even a little angry about it, because he's out in the wilderness and they couldn't go there. Therefore, they had to walk out as soon as the Sabbath was over, they had to start walking out to meet John in the wilderness. Somebody says, but why couldn't you get married on a Sunday? Well, because nobody had any time to travel to your location from the Sabbath. Well, why couldn't you get married on a Monday? Well, because you didn't have time for that feast when everybody could join you. That's why you have 3 days of feasting, so everybody can get there and join you in that feasting that happens before the wedding. That gave you Tuesday or Wednesday. So whatever this day 0 was, when they begin talking, it's probably Tuesday or Monday when they begin talking. or the day of the Sabbath, rather, when they a day after the Sabbath, when they begin Sunday, when they begin talking, then you got the next day and the day after, and then you got the third day, Wednesday, when the wedding feast at Cana happens. Okay, fun trying to think our way through it. But here's why I'm laying this out for you. Here's what this has to do with this contrast. All of John's gospel is divided in two pieces. And that second piece of John's gospel is at chapter 12. The first piece is all of prehistory, all the way through the early life of Christ, and all the way through 3 years of ministry in the first 11 chapters. And in that 11 chapters, he refers to a sequence of days only twice. Here, where he goes through those 3 days, and a little later on, chapter 6, when you have him feeding the 5,000, and the next day they come looking for food again when they're hungry. Right? So feeds them one day, then overnight they get hungry, and the next day they come back to him looking for food. But other than that, John gives you no sequence until you get to chapter 12. And chapter 12, all of a sudden, you got all this fast, speedy through time. And then chapter 12, hit the brakes. And chapter 12 to the end is the last week of his life. The death, burial, resurrection, and that little period afterwards. So you got all this information that flows through the first part of it with only some tiny hints of sequence. And then the last part, you get 6 days before the Passover, and you get that slow heartbeat that happens after that carries you through, where John is interested in some sequence. So this part where he's actually counting these days out seems to have some importance in his mind. Seems to be important enough for him that he wanted you to know that there was this very important sequence of events that happened on a number of days in this early part. Now, what is the meaning of the 3 days? I am not going to try to tie this to prophecy or tell you 3 days means some particular thing. If you're into numerology and you think 3 days is a significant number, super. I'm glad to hear that, right? 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth. Then there's a resurrection afterward, and there's a marriage and all that. You could look at this and look at prophecy and try to lay those 3 days on it, but I don't think that's his primary reason for doing it, because we get all that information later on. I don't think that's why John is actually writing this. He's actually writing it because he wants to show you the motives of the Pharisees and the significance of the miracle that happens on the third day. All that other stuff might be true, right? This might be this little type, this little picture of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. It could be all that, might be true. Would be the wrong days of the week, but it could be that it's all true. But that wasn't the point. The point he had was, you need to understand the motivation of these people. They were angry. Angry enough so that they had pre-coordinated this trip out to the wilderness before the Sabbath, so that as soon as the Sabbath was over, they could get on their high horse, so to speak, and march out there to start questioning John out in the wilderness, where he's baptizing people in the middle of nowhere by the stream. So that way you could understand the actual impact of the wedding feast at Cana. But it's interesting, though, to note that next day that occurs in chapter 1, verse 29, the next day John seeth Jesus coming unto him. So let's assume they left right after the Sabbath. You don't get very far on traveling, from 6 o'clock on Saturday night when the Sabbath ends. So they probably left early in the morning Sunday to go out to see Jesus. And they get out to see him the next day, Monday. Now they're out there and they look at him and they say, or they talk to him on Sunday. Then Monday, John looks at him and says, this is him. Right? The Pharisees came and questioned me yesterday and said, are you him? And I've been telling you all along, he's coming and I'm not him. Then the next day, Jesus shows up and he says, that's him right there. That's the one I've been telling you about. But notice what's conspicuously absent from that whole part is the Pharisees. Everybody else seems to be there. But the Pharisees don't get this message. That's him. Because you see, they came out with one motive in mind. Are you the Messiah? Or are you Elijah? Or are you that prophet? No, 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 fine, we're done with you. We don't care. We're going back to town. The next day, he says, this is the one. Okay. Now we get actually down to chapter 2, the wedding feast at Cana. And I'm not going to read through all the verses for you. I am going to cause your attention to some of the incidents that occur. First of all, Jesus and his disciples are bidden to the wedding, and they are disposed to go. They get to the wedding, and they're in this wedding feast. And when they're in this wedding feast, a need arises. And what is the need? They need wine. Why do they need wine? Because they're out of it. This is a legitimate need. And he gets a legitimate request to meet that need. And he denies the request. No, I'm not going to do that for you. And you might wonder to yourself, wow, if this really was a legitimate need, you're telling me God doesn't answer prayers just because there's a need? Yeah, that is true. He doesn't answer prayers just because there's a need. But that isn't the point of the story. So there's a need and there's a request, and he denies it. And his reason for denying it is, my hour has not yet come. But then he does the miracle. And if you were thinking about it saying, what does this mean? Why is this the case? What's the connection between my hour has not yet come and he does the miracle anyway? And the answer is tied up in that little conversation that we're given privy insight into at the end of this whole thing. When the governor of the feast goes to the bridegroom and makes that statement. And he says, everybody else, what verse is that? Go down a few verses. There it is. Verse 8. And verse 9. Go to verse 9. When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew it knew it, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom. Keep going. By the way, notice how he says that. Didn't call out to the bridegroom, didn't go to where the bridegroom was, called the bridegroom to him. So in other words, the governor of the feast wants to have a private conversation with the bridegroom. So he's not going to do it in front of everybody. He's going to call him off to the side and have this little conversation with him. And he's going to say something important, right? And he said unto him, every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine. And when men have drunk, he says, worse wine. But you did it the other way around. In which case, the contrast is painful. Because what John is saying is, what God served in the first covenant was worse. And what he served in the second covenant was good. In fact, you almost have to accept that if you accept the book of Hebrews. Because if what came later was better, then what came first was worse. No escape. He's making a contrast. And so Jesus says, it's not my hour. I am not come now to be transforming things in the world. That's not why I'm here. I'm not here just to start dispensing blessings. That's not what this is all about. But I'm going to do a miracle. And the reason I'm going to do this miracle is so that you can understand the difference between what you've always known and now what the reality is. What you've always known was worse. As great as it was. Was it really wine? Yes, it was wine. Was it made from grapes? Yes. Was it watered down? No. It just was worse wine. Was the law good? Yes. Was it watered down? No. It just was worse. It was a worse covenant than the covenant Jesus brought. Moses, was he good? Yes. He just was worse than Jesus was. So we see the contrast continue. Chapter 2 now, verses 13 through 16, which is the contrast of ownership. And the Jews' Passover was at hand. Notice again, he makes this statement so that Gentiles who read this would be able to understand who Jesus was. Not writing necessarily to the Jews, writing to a broader audience, most likely to the Gentiles. He says the Jews' Passover was at hand. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, Take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. So I want you to notice how Jesus, the contrast of Jesus to everything else, the ownership of the temple under Jesus Christ to the ownership of the temple under Moses. Under Moses, you had to have all this perfect stuff. It only made sense if you needed a perfect, spotless turtle dove or a perfect, spotless lamb. And lambs are clumsy and prone to getting scrapes and bruises all the time. So what you would need, the ideal thing would be to have a lamb that was pre-approved. We know this one is spotless. We've inspected it. We've been taking care of it to make sure it's spotless so that you could have this sacrifice. So you go there and you give them some money. They give you some change back because you always, it's the way it always works with money. You always end up with a big pocket full of change, right? And they give you some change back to it. And you've got your sheep that's pre-approved. Now you go in with your receipt. They don't have to spend time inside inspecting it again because it's already pre-inspected. We know this one is great. And so since we're controlling it from one end to the other, we know this one is pre-approved. We know it's good. Come on in and we'll offer this one in sacrifice for you. That way, it's all being done very precisely according to the law. And Jesus comes and says, you missed it. This is my house. We're not here for that. I got another plan. You are supposed to go through the pain. You're supposed to understand what it was about. You're not even going to understand me if you keep buying pure sheep. You're supposed to labor to get one that was pure. You're supposed to carry it up here and make sure it didn't get bruised and go through the effort of doing all that. You don't even get the picture. Let me clean up the picture for you because this is my temple. I can make the picture clear. What astounds me is what's missing from this story. And it's missing from this story in every rendition of it. And that is, nobody got mad at him about it. Nobody arrested him for it. Then we go to chapter 3, and almost everybody misses chapter 3, the lesson of Nicodemus. Because it's got some beautiful things in it. Chapter 3, verse 16, isn't that a beautiful verse? There's just beautiful things in the story. But what's the story really about? Well, Nicodemus gives you the key in his opening words, and Jesus repeats it later. And Michael covered it in Sunday school this morning. In his opening words, Nicodemus says, we know. And then Jesus proceeds to prove to him, You really don't. So let me tell you what we know. The story of Nicodemus is a story of the contrast of the knowledge you get under the law about God. Nicodemus, it turns out, a student of the law, a rabbi, a teacher of the law, really didn't understand much about God. And Jesus has to start at the very basics to begin to teach him about God. And then tell him, you don't know, but we do. Because we teach the things we know and the things we've seen. And I'm going to summarize from here. I wish I had time to go through the details of everything to follow, to show you every single other contrast that John is laying out for you from here through chapter 11. But we're only in chapter 3 right now, and there's a lot of contrast to come. So let's think about some of them. So the knowledge of God under the law is the first part of chapter 3. Just so you get it, I'll read Jesus' response to that thing in verse 10 through 12. Jesus answered and said unto him, Art thou a master in Israel and knowest not these things? Right? Nicodemus was the one who broke it out and said, we know. And Jesus said, yeah, you do because you've been studying the law, but you don't know these things. Right? Verily, verily, I say unto thee, we speak what we do know and testify what we have seen, and you receive not our witness. If I have told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall ye believe if I tell you heavenly things? The law was not able to impart to Nicodemus the knowledge of heavenly things, but Jesus was. The next contrast is the contrast of authority, and it happens in John chapter 3, verses 30 through 35. And it is John's statement of Jesus' authority. John says, he must increase, but I must decrease. He that cometh from above is above all. There's that statement of authority. He that is of the earth is earthy and speaketh of the earth. He that cometh from heaven is above all, just in case you didn't get it. And then there was that nobleman who sent that the message said or came to Jesus and had that whole interaction with him in chapter 4. It begins in chapter 4 and verses 48 through 51. And it just shortly before that, you had the comparison of Jesus to the patriarchs in John chapter 4, verses 12 through 14. You have the comparison of authority. The words of Jesus are greater authority than our sight. They're greater authority than what we think is real. They're greater authority than what we know because Jesus is the greater authority. And you get that in the end of there. But then you get the story after that of the Sabbath, the Lord of the Sabbath versus the Sabbath, and the man by the pool who gets healed on the Sabbath day and does something that's actually illegal to do on the Sabbath day, but he does it by the command of Jesus, and Jesus has the ability to command you to do something on the Sabbath day. He is the Lord of the Sabbath, and then he points out to the Pharisees later on, and he says, hey, when a man gets 8 days old, a boy child is 8 days old, and you have to circumcise him, and it must be done on the 8th day, and you bring him to the temple, and it's the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do any work, but you circumcise him on the 8th day anyhow. And even though you're technically breaking the law of Moses, you don't consider it broken because you're doing it by command. And if it's okay to cut a man open on the Sabbath day, wouldn't it be good for me, who is the Lord of the Sabbath, to make a man completely whole on the Sabbath day? And the answer is yes. You didn't even understand what the Sabbath was about. And then he goes into healing versus killing. The very greatest motive you have under the law is the motive to kill. I'm sorry, but that's the truth. It's the motive to kill. Somebody does this, stone him to death. Don't let it be spoken in Israel. Somebody does that, stone him to death. And Jesus, as a woman taken in adultery, presented before him, and there's absolutely no excuse for her behavior. And you say, yeah, but she was set up by the Pharisees. It doesn't matter under the law. She committed adultery under the law. There is a definitive punishment. The greatest motive under the law is to kill her, and Jesus does something completely the opposite of that. You think, well, he must be a lawbreaker because the law said to do something. He refused to do what the law said. He was the Lord of that thing, and he had a better motive than the law did, and the law was okay, but it was worse than grace. And Jesus points it out. So you get the comparison. And we could go on, fasting versus feeding, nature versus Jesus in John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21, and life-sustaining versus life-giving in chapter 6, verses 32 and 33, condemnation versus justification in John 8, 10 through 11, and the patriarchs versus the son in John chapter 8, verses 39, 53, and 56. And in the end, the law versus true sight in John chapter 9, verses 39 through 41. And I wish we had time to cover all the details. But I only have time to point it out to you today, that you would read the Gospel of John a little bit differently and look for where John is setting Jesus against something else for the very specific purpose of showing you the difference so that you might see Jesus Christ clearly, remove the confusion from your mind, and live by faith. And I want to close with this remark. If what you heard me say today was everything that was under the old covenant was bad, then you didn't hear me correctly. What was under the old covenant was good. It just happened to be worse. And if what you heard me say today was you really don't have to drink in the Old Testament to believe in Jesus, that is what I'm saying. In fact, that's what John said. John went all the way back to the very beginning, showed you the creation, skipped everything else except to put it as a background, a contrast against Jesus, that Jesus Christ might stand out starkly and uniquely in all of history, that you might have faith in him, and having faith, you might have life. Let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the time we've had together today. I pray for these here present and for those at home. And I ask, O Lord, that their faith might be renewed and strengthened, that they might see Jesus as he truly is, as the only begotten Son of God, that they might find life through his name. And I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.